Welcome, everyone. We are so excited that you're joining us for week 3 of our life group study. We love it that you are digging into these treasures together, sharing your stories, and just fellowshipping with one another. Pastor T, I was thinking, do you have a life group?
Ooh,
Or do you belong to a life group?
awkward. Let me reverse the question. How many life groups are you leading personally?
Why are you reversing the question?
Just
I
answer
asked you a
just
question.
answer the question.
Okay.
You have one, right?
Since you're my boss, I have two.
You have two. Okay.
I have two.
Well, I got five. Carolyn and I are leading a life group network, and I love the networks. It's a Thursday night marriage group network. We've got over 50 people in one room, all divided into tables, and every table has a life group coach, a leader, a shepherd, and we're leading one of those, and then we're leading five. So, but we're going into week 4 of our life group right now. And the relational dynamics, I didn't know most of these people around the table, and the relational dynamics that are happening around the table is just a lot of fun, and we're going deeper, and people are hanging around longer, and it's just so beneficial to be part of a life group.
All right, so man, that's exciting. So far we've been digging into a lot of different treasures.
Man, and they are some awesome treasures. I mean, stuff you wouldn't even imagine, right? God's wrath,
That's right.
Justification, sin, sanctification. I mean, these are big theological words that we're actually finding in the book of Romans, in the scriptures, and we're applying them to our lives. And today we're going to move on to God's sovereignty.
Oh, that's a big one. You kind of just spilled the beans there with that one. Okay, no anticipation, anything, but that's good. God's sovereignty. But before we go into sovereignty, last week we had John actually dig up another treasure for us. Would you mind going into that and giving us a basic
Yeah,
recap?
John, just to kind of recap real quick, John taught a powerful message on faith from Romans 3:22, and his kind of main points were that, first of all, there are no words for it, and just a really interesting take and history of the word that we now have as faith. Secondly, that we've got to be focused to really make it all that it can be. And thirdly, that faith trumps belief, and that it's not just a transactional thing that we have with God, but it's a leaning in to be faithful to a God who's so faithful to us. So we actually want to throw it back to you right now and get you talking around your life group and answer this question. When is it that you put faith in Christ? If you are a Christ follower, when, why, and how did you first come to faith in Christ? Why don't you just take a little bit of time to share that, hit pause, and then we'll be back and we'll carry on in our study on sovereignty.
When we think about the word sovereignty, usually in Christian circles, we think about God, right? He is sovereign. He is a king with a kingdom. However, many a times that sovereignty doesn't impact our everyday life. Is there any words or any thoughts around that?
Yeah, R.C. Sproul, I love some of the words that he says. He says this: if God is not sovereign over the entire created order, then he is not sovereign at all. The term sovereignty too easily becomes a chimera, which means a fantasy. If God is not sovereign, then he is not God. And in fact, he goes on to say this: most Christians salute the sovereignty of God, but believe in the sovereignty of man. I think R.C. Sproul just really kind of brings that down to a practicality that causes us to want to pay attention to this. Now, what we've been doing throughout this series, though, is we take these deeply theological words and we try to bring life to them through illustrations or stories. You've got a story about sovereignty and about wrestling with God's sovereignty. Why don't you share that with us?
Yeah, okay. Well, it's a kind of personal story. And it was in 2010. Me and Jessica, we were newly married, 1 year in, and we were living in Kenya. What happened also, my sister was planning a destination wedding in the Bahamas. And I heard my mom actually hurt her back. And so Jess and myself, we had time back in those days. We decided to, go to the Bahamas and see if we can help her out a bit. When we came to the Bahamas, it was more than we expected. Mom just didn't hurt her back. She slipped 2 discs within her back. and she was in constant pain. Now, Jessica, myself, we had lots of plans. I mean, it's the Bahamas, right? And we want to do a lot of things, but we also want to help out with the wedding. However, we soon realized that we were no longer in charge. We weren't in charge of our day. We weren't in charge of the weeks ahead. Mom's pain literally consume all our energies.
You know what? That's interesting because when I think of the Bahamas, I think of paradise, right? I mean, I think how could anything go wrong other than a hurricane in the Bahamas, right? Yeah. And here you're telling us that real life found you guys there, found your mom there, and found you. Yeah. In fact, it leads to a great question for all of us. Do you have control issues, and have you ever found it difficult to relinquish control to God, to something that is bigger than you? Have you ever been out of control? There's going to be a question on your screen. Go ahead, hit the pause button, take a look at that, do some discussing, then we'll be back together. All right, I'm sorry. I guess I interrupted your story, but I think we were all interested in hearing how all of us grapple with situations when we're not in control. But what happened?
Yeah, well, I mean, two slip disc, lots of pain. I mean, the first thing we tried to do was see if our insurance covered the surgery, because we thought, hey, we need to get her to a doctor so that they can check it out. We did that, and we found out that her insurance didn't cover it, and we then started looking outside of her insurance to see how much it would cost. It was around $21,000. Wow. And at that time, I mean, listen, newly married, we planning a wedding for our sisters. I mean, we were literally broke, and so the only thing we could do or think of at that time was to pray. We just decided to pray, hoping that God would just take this pain away, because we didn't have any other options.
Yeah. Talk about a situation where you're completely out of control. You're feeling so tiny and you don't have the resources to handle the situation. And it begs lots of questions, right? Mm-hmm. It begs the question, where is God in this situation? If God is sovereign and in control of everything, then why is this happening to your mom? Why is this happening to your family? To dig into that more, we're actually going to do some Bible study together. We want you to take a look at the 11 verses that are going to be on the screen, and we want you to have a scribe for your group, somebody to record your answers. Draw a line down the center of a page. On the one side, list out all the things you learn as a group about God's sovereignty. On the other side, list all the questions that this raises, because these scriptures actually raise some of those questions, like, if God is so good, where is he? If he's so powerful, why does this happen? Does everybody get saved? Because there's some words predestination in here. I mean, that's another one we should probably take a look at sometime. But go ahead. You go ahead and do some Bible study together, and then we're going to come back together.
All right, welcome back, guys. Hope you had a really good discussion around those scriptures. Now, we have one more scriptures we want to share with you, Pastor T.
Yeah, Romans 9:15, powerful verse out of the Message. Is that grounds for complaining that God is unfair? And I think that's what so many people ask. Your mom, you in the Bahamas.
Where is God?
Where is God? Is God unfair? Yeah. Not so fast, please. God told Moses, I'm in charge of mercy. I'm in charge of compassion. And it goes on to say, compassion doesn't originate in our bleeding hearts or moral sweat, but in God's mercy. The same point was made when God said to Pharaoh, I picked you as a bit player in this drama of my salvation power. All we're saying is that God has the first word, initiated the action in which we play our part for better or for worse.
I like that part that talks about like it's not given by your sweat. So, we were praying and we were hoping, like, God, can you please heal? Can you please deliver? Can you please step in? That reminds me of something that I read in the Westminster Catechism. And this is what it said. God from all eternity did, by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will, freely and unchangeably, ordained whatsoever comes to pass. Yet, so as thereby neither is God the author of sin. It just means that God does whatever he wants to do, however he wants to do. It's his will that we kind of living in.
Okay, so hang on. Let me test that. Let me push back a little bit, because What if the situation with your mom in the Bahamas had gone sideways? What if it had gone bad? I mean, we would hate to even talk about that, but it's a reality for so many people.
Yeah.
You know, where's God in, what if she didn't come out of the surgery? Is God still God? Is God still good?
Yeah.
But tell us what actually happened.
You know, I'm happy that you actually said that, because there was a moment there when we prayed all the prayers we could possibly pray. You know, we fasted, we had others come to pray with us. We did all that we could do. We worshiped, and still God didn't really answered the prayer the way we expected. You know, I remember the day that mom said to us, "Listen, it's over. I'm done. Call the ambulance." And the ambulance came and they took her, and basically they sedated her. I remember going to the hospital, looking at my mom, and it's like, God, why? You know, why didn't you heal her? Like, I believe that you can supernaturally put her disc back in place, but why? Right? And I felt disappointed. And it I wouldn't say it moved my faith to not trust God, but I was very disappointed. And I didn't know what to do with that. You know, I went back home, and I remember, you know, just calling the insurance and, you know, saying, "Hey, is there any way that you guys can do this for my mom?" And you know what they said to me? They said, "Dunstan, the policy just changed. And now your mom actually is covered for this surgery." We couldn't believe it. Like, we could not believe it. Immediately, of course, we chartered a plane. It was all covered, and we flew out to the hospital of destination. They had the surgery, and you know what? Fortunately, it went well. But I understand that sometimes things may not go the way we want it to go, but it doesn't mean that God is not God. And I can look back at the many situations that we've had where things didn't go, you know, the way we would want it to go. But that doesn't mean that God is different. It doesn't mean that he's changed. He is still the same God, and we have to put our trust in his sovereignty. And what about you? You know, I have this question. Look, how do you sleep at night knowing that, you know, that God is sovereign, and despite circumstances and situations, if it doesn't go your way, that he also remains sovereign?
Yeah, you know, we deal with a lot of pain in people's lives. In fact, this week we just bid farewell to a young mom and wife who passed away, and we've been praying and fasting for months for her, and it didn't turn out. You know, we'll be doing the memorial next week, and so we deal with a lot of that stuff. But for me personally, it's a matter of size and scope. So let me give you sort of some examples out of the scriptures. So I'm gonna pop through a number of scriptures here that talk about this. So out of Matthew chapter 10, it says this. It says, "Are not two sparrows sold for a penny, and not one of them will fall to the ground apart from the Father? But even the hairs on your head," and I don't want any bald jokes right now, okay, so that's fine. "Even the hairs in your head are numbered." I go, the hairs on my back are numbered. "Fear not, therefore, you are more valuable than many sparrows." Okay, so here we've already got a little bit of a sizing of God's economy, right? That there isn't a hair on your head that falls out that God does not know about. That's talking about his greatness, and yet how small are the hairs on our heads, right? Let me turn to Psalm 8:4. "What are mere mortals that you should think about them, human beings that you should care for them?" And then Psalm 103:15. "As for man, his days are like grass, as a flower to the field, so he flourishes." Your days and my days are like grass, okay? We're talking about size and scope. We're going to get a picture of this, and I'll put it all together in a minute. James 4:14. "Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes." So when I think of size and scope, I did a message one time and I named it "Ants on a Rembrandt." Okay, so we're like these little ants walking around on this masterpiece done by this master, but I've actually come to think of God's sovereignty in size and scope differently. An ant is too big in my mind. So I'm thinking of a dust mite. A dust mite is the size of a grain of salt. That's how big a dust mite is. I kind of see myself as a dust mite, and God, we've talked about God as being this 27 million degrees burning with holiness God, who is like the size of the sun. I'm a grain of salt, a dust mite, the size of a grain of salt, and God is the size. Well, he's got to be bigger than the sun because he created it, but let's just take the sun, right? Size and scope. So I look at that. I'm a grass in the field. I'm a flower in the field. I'm a mist. I'm a breath that's here one moment and gone the next. When I think of size and scope, I think I have no ability to understand God. I'm so puny. Like when I see an ant, walking around in my house, and I just pick it up and squish it and put it away, right?
Yeah.
However, God is remarkably different in that us little dust mites, he actually sent his son to redeem us little dust mites. So when I think of size and scope, I think that God's sovereignty is so massive and my life is so small. But we often think that our lives, especially in this individualistic culture we live in, are massive. We think of our lives as being the center of the universe. Well, the scriptures say, you and I are not the center of the universe.
That's
as
right.
big as we think our lives are, there's more going on here than what we understand. And I've done this at a number of funerals, but I actually kind of also see our lives like this. I'll take a felt marker and a roll of masking tape, and I'll say, okay, see this little line right here?
Yeah.
This is I'm going to put 89 years. Okay, let's say you live to be 89 years old. This little thing here, that's your 89 years. Okay, and then what we do is we take this tape and we take it and we stretch it out. We go, wow, 89 years compared to that is not a lot, is it?
It's not.
And then I have somebody walk out the door and they're walking. And I say, okay, that tape continues to go, right? And if we could go, like the direction we're sitting right now, if you kept going, you'd end up in Phoenix.
That's right.
Like thousands of miles away. And here's your little tiny 89 years in comparison to eternity. And I look at what's happening in my life, the pain, the losses, even my own death one day. And I go, it's just a little tick on this thing that's thousands of miles, and thousands of miles isn't even enough, right? It's simply a matter of size and scope. That's how I reconcile God's sovereignty. I look at it and say, you know what? God is so massive. God's purposes are so massive. What would a dust mite understand? If I walked into a room and there's a dust mite and just I'm the size, I'm not the size of a sun, I'm just my size. What does that dust mite understand about my thinking,
Nothing.
about my thought processes,
Nothing.
about where I came from, where I'm going, what I'm planning to do? Nothing, has no clue, can't relate at all. And yet we're in the same universe. Well, God is transcendent outside of our universe. And so when I think of size and scope, that answers so much of this God's sovereignty issue for me. And I've taught as well that God is not in control. Okay, now, some people kind of get a little freaked out by that.
Yeah.
But what I mean by that is that I believe, and now this brings up the whole Calvinistic Arminian thing,
Yes.
right? Calvin believes that only God predestined certain people and chose certain people to be part of his kingdom. Those people at our church are predestined. Everybody else, you don't bother witnessing to them because God hasn't decided that they'll be in the kingdom. Arminianism says that we have free will in this. I tend to be more on the Arminian side where we have free will. And I believe that God is not in control, but he is in charge. And what I mean by that is I read the scriptures and there are times where demonic powers and the power of Satan ended up controlling a situation. God allowed it to happen, but they controlled the situation. I read scriptures where people resisted God and they decided to go a direction other than God. Does that mean that God is out of control? No, God's in charge, but he's not in control because he has given us
Free will.
Free will. And I think that is so important. So that's how I take a look at some of this stuff in terms of understanding God's sovereignty is with size and scope, and it just helps me.
That's such a hard concept to sometimes grasp, right? And I'm just saying that because many times it's hard for us to think that we're not in charge, right? It's hard to also think that God doesn't relate to us, or we can't understand things about God. And it's really I'm thinking about what you said. I'm going through my head because of his love towards us, right? Like he just poured out. I mean, you wouldn't pick up an ant and start loving it up and, sending your son to, die for this ant, but God did that for us.
Exactly.
Right. And, it's definitely very insightful.
So we're going to give you one last question to talk about as a group, and that is, can you think of a time where your life was touched by God's sovereignty, but you didn't understand it except by looking in the rearview mirror, sort of in retrospect? But then you kind of stood back and you came to grips with God's sovereignty in that situation. It sounds like that's what happened to you guys in the Bahamas with your mom's situation. You realize God is still in control.
Yes.
And so we want you to talk about that, and then we're going to be back together for a moment.
All right. Well, wow. That was a really good treasure that we were able to dig up, the treasure of God's sovereignty. Yeah, well, guys, we're going to sign off now. We just want to say thank you so much for joining us and hope this discussion was very uplifting for you. Okay, now, we're not going to tell you what to do after. I think by now you probably have your own pace and own thing that you're doing in your life group. So enjoy your time together.
Yeah, and we're looking forward to being back together again next week.